The last thing David Carter held in his hands that Tuesday morning was a piece of paper that had no right to feel so heavy. It was a single sheet, printed on standard white stock, bearing the letterhead of Meridian National Bank, and the number printed in bold near the bottom, just above the signature line of some officer he had never met, was $83,412. Not a mortgage balance. Not a business loan. A hospital debt. A dead man's hospital debt, and it had become, through no choice of his own, the defining arithmetic of David Carter's 38th year on Earth. He set the letter on the kitchen table beside his coffee mug, pressed both palms flat against the surface, and stared at it the way a man stares at a wound he has already accepted will not heal clean, not with panic, not with fury, but with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been running the same losing race for 3 years straight and has only just now, finally, begun to feel his legs give out beneath him. The house itself was not remarkable. A 2-bedroom craftsman on the east side of Millbrook, Ohio, with aluminum siding that had weathered from cream to the color of old newspaper, a covered porch that sagged slightly at the left corner, and a backyard that backed up to a chain-link fence someone had planted morning glories along years ago. The flowers still came back every summer, reliable and oblivious. David's father, Harold Carter, had bought the house in the early 1990s with money he had saved over 7 years of working rotating shifts at a machine tool plant, and he had lived in it for the remainder of his life without ever fully paying it off. When Harold died of complications from congestive heart failure 2 years and 8 months ago, after 14 months in and out of 3 different medical facilities, the house passed to David, along with the unpaid balance on the medical accounts, the accumulated interest, and a stack of billing statements that David had to read 3 times before he could make himself believe the total. He had no siblings to share the weight. His mother had passed when he was 11. There was no inheritance beyond 4 walls and a debt that seemed, on certain nights, to breathe. David worked at Halcott Industrial Services, repairing and calibrating large-format manufacturing equipment for factories across a 3-county radius. He was good at it, genuinely good, the kind of technician who could hear a belt alignment problem before he saw it, who kept his tools organized with a precision that his co-workers ribbed him about, but privately respected. He earned decent wages, steady and honest. But decent wages, when divided against a mortgage that had been refinanced twice to cover medical shortfalls, and a hospital debt accruing interest at a rate that seemed designed to ensure it never actually diminished, left him with very little. He had taken a second job 3 nights a week driving for a delivery service, loading and unloading freight at a regional distribution center from 10 at night until 2 in the morning, then rising at 5:30 to be at Halcott by 7. He had been doing this for 22 months. He had lost 14 pounds, not intentionally. He had stopped answering calls from friends because he did not know how to explain, without embarrassment or bitterness, why he could not come to a birthday dinner or split the cost of a weekend trip. He lived inside the house his father had loved, and he paid for it with the hours of his life in quantities that left almost nothing over for living. The bank's notice was not a surprise. He had known the foreclosure process was advancing. He had spoken twice with a housing counselor who was kind and thorough, and ultimately unable to manufacture options that did not exist. The bank had extended once, in exchange for a lump payment that had emptied his emergency account down to $300. That extension expired in 11 days. The counselor had told him, gently, that without a significant cash event or a legal intervention, the house would enter formal proceedings by the end of the month. David had thanked her, hung up the phone, and sat in his father's old armchair for a long time without turning on any lights. He thought about Harold often in those weeks. Not with resentment, never that. Or almost never, but with a complicated tenderness that had no clean name. Harold Carter had been a quiet man, given to long silences and small gestures. He fixed things. He kept a garden. He remembered the names of neighbors' children and asked about them by name years later. He had never been wealthy, never ambitious in the way that accumulates money. And he had never seemed to wish otherwise. What he wished, as far as David could tell from 38 years of observation, was simply to be useful, to leave things in better condition than he found them. David had inherited that instinct the way he had inherited Harold's wide hands and his habit of arriving 10 minutes early to everything, as if it were embedded in the tissue rather than taught. What he had not inherited, and what he desperately needed now, was a way out of the corner his father's illness had backed him into. He was still turning that problem over in his mind when, on a Saturday morning in early April, he heard the sound of more than one car door closing in front of his house, and something in the quality of the sound, some unfamiliar heaviness, made him put down his wrench and go to the window. 3 black vehicles sat at the curb. Not ordinary black vehicles, these were the kind with tinted rear windows and a particular stillness that suggested they were accustomed to arriving places and being noticed. A woman was stepping out of the middle one. She was perhaps 32 or 33, dressed in charcoal gray slacks and a fitted jacket the color of slate, her dark hair pulled back with the kind of effortless severity that tends to accompany people who have learned to make their appearance do their talking for them. She was not looking at the house with curiosity. She was looking at it the way someone looks at a destination they have already studied on a map, with recognition rather than discovery. Behind her, 2 men in quieter suits stood at a respectful distance, neither moving toward the door nor retreating toward the cars. By the time David had crossed through the front hallway and opened the door, Mrs. Paulson from across the street was already standing on her own porch with a coffee mug held in both hands, watching. The Delacroix teenagers had stopped shooting baskets in their driveway. The woman in gray looked up at David from the bottom of his porch steps, and for a moment neither of them spoke. She was composed in the way of someone who has rehearsed composure until it became genuine. There was nothing performative about it, but there was, in the precise stillness of her expression, the faint outline of something that required effort to hold in place. "Mr. Carter," she said. It was not a question. She had done her research. "My name is Sophia Bennett. I'm sorry to come without calling ahead." She paused. "I was afraid if I called, you might tell me not to come." There was a directness in this that David had not expected. No corporate preamble, no softening introduction. Just the acknowledgement of a calculated decision, offered plainly. He stepped back from the door and gestured, not quite knowing why, for her to come in. She thanked him, and the 2 men stayed outside without being asked to. She followed him down the narrow hallway to the kitchen, where the bank letter was still lying on the table beside his cooling coffee, and she sat in the chair he pulled out for her without looking at it. He sat across from her. He waited. She placed a leather document folder on the table between them. She did not open it. She looked at him directly and said, without preamble, "My father passed away 6 months ago." She said it with the controlled steadiness of someone who has spoken those words many times since they became true and has not yet fully reconciled with them. His name was Gerald Bennett. He built Bennett Technology Group, which is now. She paused briefly, as if the sentence were one she was still deciding how to complete, what it has become. But 30 years before any of that, he was a 26-year-old engineer working a contract job at a fabrication plant in western Ohio. And he was badly hurt in a workplace accident, and someone helped him when no one else did. She stopped. She let that sentence sit between them and watched David's face, and he watched her back with an expression that was trying to sort itself into recognition and failing. She said, quietly but with certainty, "I believe that person was your father." David did not move for a moment. He had the sensation of a room tilting slightly, not dramatically, not the dizziness of shock, but the subtle reorientation of a perspective shifting on its axis. He said, "My father never mentioned anyone named Bennett." The words came out slowly, carefully, as if he were handling something that might be fragile. Sophia nodded. "Once." "I know," she said. "He wouldn't have. From everything I've learned about Harold Carter, that is exactly the kind of man he was." She opened the folder then, and slid a photograph across the table toward him. A color photograph, slightly faded at the edges, of a young man with dark hair and a wide, unguarded smile, standing in front of a building David did not recognize. The man in the photograph looked nothing like the powerful executive his daughter had grown up alongside. He looked like someone at the beginning of something, grateful to be standing upright. "That was my father," Sophia said. "The year after the accident. The year Harold Carter changed the entire direction of his life. What happened 25 years ago did not begin dramatically. It began the way most things that matter begin, quietly, without announcement. In the middle of an ordinary week, Gerald Bennett had been working a 6-week contract at a metal stamping plant called Riedler Fabrication in a town called Dunmore, about 40 miles from where David now lived. He was young, underpaid, and skilled enough to know it, working a position that required close-range operation of a hydraulic press that had been flagged for maintenance issues the week before and never properly serviced. On a Thursday afternoon in November, the press cycled incorrectly, and Gerald's left forearm was caught in the descent. He was pulled free, but the damage was severe: a compound fracture, torn ligaments, extensive soft tissue injury that would require surgery and months of rehabilitation. He was taken to Dunmore General by ambulance. He had no health insurance through the contractor, a fact that was buried in the terms of his employment agreement in language designed to be overlooked. He had $420 in his checking account. He had no family within 3 states. When he was released from the hospital 4 days later with a cast, a prescription he could not afford to fill, and a follow-up appointment he had no way to pay for, he sat on the hospital's front steps in the November cold without knowing, specifically, what to do next. He could not drive. He had no one to call who could actually help. He had been told by the plant's contract manager, in a brief and impersonal phone call to his hospital room, that his services were no longer required, and that workers' compensation claims in cases of contractor liability were subject to a review process that typically took between 4 and 8 months. He sat on those steps for 45 minutes, and then a man who had been walking past, not running errands nearby, not waiting for someone, just walking past, stopped and asked him if he was all right. The man was Harold Carter, who was 41 years old at the time, a maintenance technician at a different plant across town. A man with a modest house and a teenage son at home, and no particular reason to stop. He stopped anyway. He asked. Gerald told him the outline of it: the accident, the hospital, the empty account, the nowhere to go, and Harold listened without offering advice until Gerald was done. Then he offered Gerald a ride, which turned into a meal, which turned into the use of his couch for 2 nights, while Gerald figured out next steps, which turned into Harold driving Gerald to the specialist follow-up appointment and paying the copay out of his own wallet, and which eventually turned into Harold making a call to a friend of a friend who knew someone doing electrical systems work in Columbus, who needed a reliable hand, who could work one-armed in the short term, and would be fully recovered in 6 months. The loan Harold extended to cover Gerald's prescription costs and first month's rent in Columbus was $480. Harold wrote it on a piece of paper and said it could be paid back whenever, and that if it couldn't be paid back, that was fine too. Gerald left for Columbus in early December. He wrote Harold a letter, an actual paper letter, addressed to the house in Millbrook, thanking him and promising repayment. Harold wrote back briefly, saying the money was nothing, to focus on the work and the recovery. They exchanged 2 more letters over the following year, and then correspondence lapsed, the way it does between people who are both busy rebuilding their lives from different starting positions and have not yet acquired the habit of maintaining contact across the distance. Gerald recovered. He worked the Columbus job, then another, then landed a role at a startup electronics firm that was building circuit management systems for industrial equipment. He turned out to have a gift for it, a gift sharpened, in ways he would later articulate to his daughter, by the humility of having been knocked down and helped up by someone who expected nothing. He worked with an intensity that had direction now, a specific gratitude fueling it. Within 8 years, he had co-founded a company of his own. Within 15, Bennett Technology Group had annual revenues of $400 million. Within 20, it was a billion-dollar enterprise with offices in 6 countries. He never forgot Harold Carter. He never forgot the steps of Dunmore General, or the cold, or the specific quality of kindness that does not require an audience. He tried, more than once, to locate Harold to repay the loan with interest, to offer something, to make the accounting come out right in his own conscience. But Harold Carter had moved twice in the intervening years, and Gerald's early attempts at finding him were were made in the era before digital searches made such things simple, and then business consumed him, and years accumulated. And the debt sat in his chest, unresolved, not forgotten, but somehow not yet discharged. Sophia knew all of this, because her father had told her not once, dramatically, but in small pieces over many years, the way people tell the stories that mean most to them. Incrementally, almost accidentally, as if the full weight of it can only be revealed a little at a time without crushing something. He had told her that the $480 Harold Carter had lent him was the most consequential money he had ever touched. He had told her that every good thing that had followed was built, in some measure, on the foundation of someone else's decency. It was after Gerald Bennett's death, 6 months before Sophia appeared on David's porch, that the full accounting of that old debt finally surfaced. Gerald had been organized his whole life, the discipline of someone who had once been very poor and very frightened, and had decided that clarity and order were forms of respect for what he had been given. His personal files were meticulous. When Sophia and her mother began the quiet, sorrowful work of going through his study, they found, in the third drawer of his mahogany filing cabinet, a wooden box that had clearly been placed there with intention. It was not large, the size of a shoebox, made of pale oak, latched with a small brass clasp. Inside it was a collection of objects that Sophia recognized immediately, from their specificity and their care, as things her father had kept because they were irreplaceable. There was a photograph, the one she would later show David. There was a single folded letter on aging stationery, in Harold Carter's handwriting, that said simply, "I hope Columbus is everything you need it to be. Work hard, and be well. H." There were 2 additional letters in what Sophia assumed was Gerald's own earlier handwriting, addressed but never sent. And at the bottom of the box, beneath a small envelope containing what appeared to be $480 in cash, apparently restocked and maintained over the years as a symbol of something, a placeholder for an accounting he had never been able to complete, there was a final letter, in a sealed envelope, written in Gerald's hand. On the outside he had written, "For whoever finds Harold Carter's family." Sophia had sat with the box in her lap for a long time before opening that letter. She had opened it eventually, alone in her father's study, with the lamp on and the rest of the house quiet. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten, dated 18 months before Gerald's death written. She understood, during the period when he had first received a serious diagnosis and had begun the quiet project of putting things in order. In it, Gerald described the accident, the hospital steps, Harold Carter, the loan, the letters, the years of failed attempts to reconnect. He described what Harold's intervention had meant, not in broad abstractions, but in specific terms. The fact that the prescription Harold had helped him fill had prevented an infection that could have ended his ability to use the arm entirely. The fact that the Columbus job had led directly to the firm that had led directly to Bennett Technology Group. The fact that every subsequent decision he had made had been informed, in some irreducible way, by the experience of being treated generously by someone with no reason to be generous. And in the final paragraph, in handwriting that was slightly less steady than the pages before it, Gerald had written the words that Sophia would later read aloud to David, and then to others. "If one day you find Harold Carter's family, do not send a check. Go yourself. Sit with them. Tell them what their father did. A debt of this kind was never really about money, and money alone cannot be what closes it. Tell them that everything he gave was returned, multiplied, and that the measure of it is not in what I built but in who I tried to become. And if there is any way to make their lives easier, make them easier, not as payment, but as continuation." Sophia had spent 4 months locating David Carter. The process had required the kind of methodical determination that she had inherited from her father, and honed in 2 decades of running a company that did not tolerate the imprecision of half-completed tasks. Harold Carter was deceased that she learned quickly. His son David was alive, working in Millbrook, living in the family home. She had learned about the hospital debt, the bank proceedings, the financial pressure. She had learned it from a combination of public records and a discreet inquiry conducted by the firm's legal team, not from any invasive examination of David's private affairs, but from the kinds of documents that become public when a house approaches foreclosure. And she had understood, From the moment she knew the shape of his situation, that appearing at his door with a personal check would accomplish the letter of her father's instruction while betraying its spirit entirely. So she had prepared carefully, and she had come in person, and she had brought the box with her father's handwriting in it. And she had sat down at David Carter's kitchen table and told him the whole story. David listened to all of it, without interrupting. He was a man who had learned to listen completely from Harold. From years of diagnosing machinery by sound and feel, before touching a wrench, from the specific education of living alone with a large and unresolvable problem that talking about too quickly only made worse. When Sophia finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a mockingbird was doing its impersonation of something, cycling through sounds in the bright April air. David looked at the photograph of young Gerald Bennett for a long moment. Then he looked at the letter in Gerald's handwriting. Then he looked at Sophia. He said, "He took in a stranger, not a question, a recognition. He never told me. He never." He stopped. He pressed the back of his hand briefly to his mouth. A gesture so automatic and contained it almost wasn't visible. "He never made anything about himself," David said. "That's just what he was like." Sophia nodded. Her eyes were careful and steady. "I know," she said. And there was in those two words the particular weight of someone who has spent months learning to know something that they wished they had known sooner. There was more to the story that Sophia had only partially revealed by that point, a more specific accounting that she had withheld. Not from calculation, but because she had wanted the human story to land first, before the practical one obscured it. The morning after their first conversation, she asked David if she could sit with him again. And she brought with her a member of her company's legal team, a measured woman named Claire Novak, who had spent 2 years in healthcare billing litigation before joining Bennett's legal division. Claire had, in the weeks before their visit, reviewed every document associated with Harold Carter's hospital bills and the subsequent debt assignment, not as a favor to Sophia, though she would have done it as a favor, but because what she had found in the first hour of review had shifted it from a personal errand into a professional obligation. The billing records were a mess. Not an obvious mess. Not the kind of mess that announces itself to a layperson, but the kind of systematic disorder that Claire recognized immediately as the residue of what was charitably called administrative error and uncharitably called something else. Charges had been billed and rebilled across the transitions between Harold's 3 different care facilities. A physical therapy line item had been duplicated across 7 months of statements and never corrected. A pharmaceutical charge had been applied at a rate that reflected a private pay markup that Harold had not qualified for, given that he had been enrolled in a Medicare supplement plan for the final 2 years of his life. A plan whose coverage documents had apparently never been cross-referenced against the billing records by anyone with the time or inclination to do so. Claire explained to David, sitting at his kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a series of color-coded spreadsheets, had been legitimate. Harold Carter had received extensive, expensive medical care, and a portion of that care was genuinely his financial responsibility. But the figure that had been assigned to David, the figure that had grown over 3 years of interest, accumulation, and collection fees and administrative charges, was not the legitimate portion. A conservative accounting placed the genuine, defensible outstanding balance at somewhere between $31,000 and $35,000, not $83,000, not even close to $83,000. David sat with this information for a long time. He had asked Claire, twice, to walk him through the arithmetic again, not because he doubted her, but because he had been living inside the larger number for so long that his mind resisted the revision the way an eye resists sudden light. Claire walked him through it both times, patiently, pointing to the specific line items with her pen. After the second pass, David pushed back from the table slightly and looked at the ceiling for a moment. He said, very quietly, "I've been paying a number that was never right," Claire said. "You've been paying a number that was inflated by errors no one corrected, in a system that did not have an incentive to correct them." There was a gentleness in her voice that was distinct from sympathy. It was the gentleness of someone who has seen this pattern many times and has not stopped being angry about it. On behalf of the people it happens to, what followed was not simple. The institutions involved the billing department of the primary facility, the collection agency that had purchased the debt from the secondary hospital, and the bank that had advanced a home equity line to cover an early balloon payment, did not respond to Claire Novak's formal correspondence with the eagerness of entities that have recognized their error and are anxious to make it right. The billing department replied with a form letter citing a review process timeline of 45 to 90 business days. The collection agency disputed the characterization of the duplicated charges, citing their own internal audit as definitive. The bank said, essentially, that the question of whether the underlying debt was accurately calculated was not relevant to the contractual terms of the home equity instrument, which were what they were. These responses were predictable. Claire had anticipated each of them, and the response to each was already drafted when the letters arrived. This was the part of the process that David could not have navigated alone, not because he was not intelligent enough, which he absolutely was, but because the language of institutional dispute resolution is a specialized dialect designed to be impenetrable to people who did not spend years learning it. Sophia was not passive in this process. She had been clear to David from the beginning, someone who would hand a problem to her team and step away until it was resolved. She reviewed Claire's filings herself. She made calls, not calls that leveraged her company's name improperly. She was precise about that boundary, but calls that conveyed a level of attention and preparation that institutions prefer not to deal with when they have a choice. She attended the mediation session with the collection agency in person, and her presence in the room, not intimidating but undeniably serious, altered the tempo of the negotiation in ways that benefited the outcome. The bank, which was the most intractable party, ultimately agreed to a restructured settlement that cleared the home equity instrument and removed the foreclosure proceedings from David's file, in exchange for a payment that Sophia made on Harold Carter's behalf, not as a gift to David. She was careful with the framing of this, but as the discharge of a specific debt of gratitude that her father had died without completing. Through all of it, David worked his regular shifts and his delivery nights and tried not to build his hope too high, because he had been disappointed by processes before and knew that systems did not resolve themselves on sentiment. But he also, for the first time in 3 years, felt something in the architecture of his days that he could only describe when he tried to put words to it late at night in the armchair that had been Harold's, as the return of a specific kind of oxygen, the sense that the walls were not actually closing, that the arithmetic could change, that what was happening was not punishment for something he had done or failed to do, but a wrong that was capable of being righted. He remembered his father saying, in the particular offhand way Harold had of dropping important things without fanfare, "If you do your part honestly, the ledger tends to balance." David had heard this most of his life, and had believed it with moderate confidence, and now, in the strange April of his 38th year, found himself believing it more specifically. Not blindly, but with evidence. He also found himself thinking, during those weeks, about the shape of what Sophia had told him about Gerald Bennett on hospital steps, about Harold stopping without being asked to stop, about $480 that had catalyzed a billion-dollar company in the way that only particular kinds of generosity can catalyze things. He thought about his father's silence on the subject, the complete absence, in 38 years of living alongside Harold Carter, of any mention of a man he had helped. He understood, in the thinking, that this silence was not modesty in the performance of modesty, which is its own kind of self-referential act. It was simply the natural condition of someone for whom helping was not a story to be told. It was just the thing you did when you came across a person sitting on steps in the cold. One evening in the 5th week of the legal process, Sophia came to the house without her legal team. She came with her father's wooden box, and with 2 cups of coffee from the shop on Millbrook's Main Street. And she sat at the table where all the documents had been reviewed and spread out, and she and David looked through the contents of the box together. This was different from the first visit. There was no agenda, no folder open on the table. David held Harold's letter, the actual letter, in his father's careful block handwriting. "I hope Columbus is everything you need it to be for a very long time." He turned it over once, held it up briefly toward the light, set it down. Sophia watched him without speaking. Then he picked up the unsent letters in Gerald's handwriting, the ones he had addressed to Harold, and never mailed and read through them slowly. They were not dramatic letters. They were the letters of a young man trying to articulate, with the imprecise tools of gratitude, what had been done for him. In the second letter, Gerald had written a line that David read twice before continuing. "I don't know what I would have become without that kindness. But I know it would have been less." They talked that evening for nearly 3 hours, about their fathers, about inheritance, about what it means to carry someone else's character forward in your own. Sophia told him about growing up with Gerald's particular brand of severity-laced generosity, about how he had never explained why he donated anonymously to hospital programs for uninsured workers, about how she had found, in the records of Bennett Technology Group's foundation, a recurring grant to a skilled trades rehabilitation program in Western Ohio that her father had established 20 years ago and never discussed at earnings calls. The foundation bore her father's name, but she understood now that some portion of its purpose was a sustained, private acknowledgement of a debt he felt he owed. David told her about Harold's garden, about the neighbors who had appeared on their porch over the years, sometimes strangers, sometimes not, who had, in later conversation or in condolence cards after Harold's death, mentioned something he had done for them. A car jump, started at midnight, a lawnmower repaired, a month's worth of groceries, left anonymously on a porch during a difficult period. David had known his father was a good man. He had not known the scope of it. The scope, assembled now from what Sophia had found, and what the neighbors had always known, and what the condolence cards had said, was larger than one man's quiet life usually appears to be from the inside. He was the same, Sophia said, at one point. My father, different background, different trajectory, but the same fundamental thing. He never wanted credit for what he did, he just wanted to make sure he'd done it. She turned the wooden box over slowly in her hands. I think that's why this was so hard for him. He couldn't find Harold. He couldn't close the account, and for a man like him, an unclosed account of that kind, she paused. It was weight he carried his whole life. David nodded. He understood this very well. He had been carrying a different kind of unclosed account himself, not the hospital debt that was numbers. And numbers, it turned out, could be corrected. He had been carrying the sense that his father's life had somehow ended in the wrong column, that all Harold's decency had produced, at the end, was a pile of debt and a son losing his house, that the ledger had balanced badly. He understood now, sitting across from this woman who had driven from New York with a wooden box full of evidence to the contrary, that the ledger was not balanced badly at all. The resolution of the financial proceedings came in the 6th week. Claire Novak sent David a formal summary letter that he read sitting on the front porch steps in the early morning, before work. The collection agency had agreed to a settlement that, combined with the direct payment Sophia had made to the bank, reduced David's remaining genuine obligation to an amount he could retire in 14 months at his current income without the second job. The hospital's billing department had, under the pressure of the documented discrepancies, issued a formal correction to his credit file and a partial reimbursement of overpayments, a check for $6,200 that arrived in a standard white envelope 2 weeks later, accompanied by a form letter so administratively impersonal that it contained no acknowledgement whatsoever of the 3 years of strain the uncorrected error had caused. David held the check for a moment and then set it on the table. It was not the point. It had never been the point. But it was real, and it was more than he had had on any previous Tuesday morning in recent memory. Sophia called that evening to confirm he had received the summary. When he told her he had, she said, "There's one more thing I'd like to ask you." Her voice had the particular quality it sometimes had: careful, deliberate, something being constructed with attention to precision. The foundation my father established, the Bennett Family Foundation, runs a series of programs for skilled trades, workers and their families, workforce transition, retraining, family emergency support, career development. My father ran the foundation's grant programs himself for years, and since his death it's been operating under interim leadership. She paused. I think he would have wanted someone with a different background to run it, someone who actually knows what it looks like from inside the system, not just from above it. She paused again, briefer this time. I'm not offering you a job, as a courtesy, David. I'm asking because I've spent 6 weeks watching how you handle an unjust situation. And the character you've shown is the character the foundation was built to serve and to embody. I think you should be the one to lead it. David was quiet for a long moment. He said, I fix machines. Sophia said, you also show up on time. You document everything carefully. You don't overstate what you know. You treat problems as solvable until proven otherwise. Another pause. My father would have hired you in about 30 seconds. David laughed, the first real surprised laugh he had produced in the direction of his telephone in a considerable amount of time. He said he would think about it. He thought about it for 4 days. He called her back on a Friday afternoon. He said yes. The memorial service that brought everything together happened on a Wednesday in early June. In the garden of Harold Carter's house, which was still Harold Carter's house, the foreclosure notice long since withdrawn, the morning glories coming back faithfully along the chain-link fence. It was not formally organized in advance. It began as a suggestion from David and became, in the 10 days between the suggestion and the day, something larger than either of them had planned for. Harold's neighbors came. Gerald Bennett's colleagues from the foundation came. Claire Novak came and stood in the back with her hands folded, watching with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. A man from Dunmore, now in his early 60s, a retired electrician who had worked at Reidler Fabrication in the year of Gerald's accident, and had watched Harold Carter speak with the injured man on the hospital steps without knowing. Then, who either of them was came because Sophia had found him in the course of her research and called him. And he had driven 3 hours without hesitation. He said, when David asked him why he had come so far, because I've been thinking about that day for 30 years without knowing the end of the story. I needed to know the end of it. Sophia stood at the center of the garden, with the wooden box held open in both hands. She read from her father's letter, not all of it, and not in the exact words of the original, but the essential passage, the one about kindness not being something to keep but something to pass forward. She read it clearly, without performance, in the specific flat register of someone reading words that belong to someone else, and are being given their due. Around her, in the garden of Harold Carter's house, people who had known 2 different men listened to what those 2 men had in common, and the afternoon light came through the maple at the back of the yard, in the sideways angle of early summer, and fell across the morning glories, and the slightly sagging porch, and the face of David Carter, who was standing at the edge of the gathering with his hands in his pockets, looking at his father's house with an expression that had shed most of its weight. He was wearing a clean shirt. He had slept 8 hours the previous 3 nights. The second job had ended 6 weeks ago, and the absence of those hours had not yet fully resolved into anything else. Some nights, he simply sat in the quiet and felt the quiet as the thing it was, rather than as the absence of noise he was supposed to be filling with productivity. When Sophia finished reading, she closed the box and looked at David across the gathered people. He held her gaze briefly, then looked up at the maple, then down at the morning glories. He had been trying, for several days, to locate the exact thought he wanted to have when this moment arrived, the summation, the sentence that would make the accounting feel complete. He had not been able to find it in advance, and he found now that he did not need to. The accounting had made itself complete by some mechanism that did not require him to narrate it. What he felt, standing in Harold Carter's garden on an early June Wednesday, in the middle of what should have been the worst year of his life, was something that had no clean name either, like the first one, the tenderness for his father that he'd been carrying since the hospital. It was not happiness, exactly, though it contained happiness. It was not relief, exactly, though it contained relief. It was closer to the sensation of a large, persistent pressure simply not being there anymore. Of a room that had always been slightly too warm, finally. Quietly opening a window. Later that evening, after the last car had left and the garden had gone quiet again, David sat on the front porch steps. He had brought Harold's photograph from the mantelpiece inside a standard portrait, taken at some unremarkable occasion, in which Harold Carter was smiling the modest smile of a man who found the act of posing for photographs mildly embarrassing. David held the photograph with both hands and looked at it for a long time in the last of the day's light. He thought about the hospital steps in Dunmore. He thought about a 26-year-old man sitting in the November cold with no money and no options, and the length of his future undecided. He thought about his father, walking past and choosing not to keep walking. In the unremarkable and irreversible way that certain choices are made not with drama, not with calculation, but with the simple recognition that there was something that needed to be done, and he was there to do it. He thought about Gerald Bennett's billion-dollar company, and about a foundation in New York that had been quietly returning something for 20 years, and about a wooden box with $480 in it that had never been spent because the accounting it stood for could not be closed with money. He thought about the loan, the couch, the prescription, the phone call to Columbus. He thought about a man who had done all of this without mentioning it once. He set the photograph on the step beside him and looked at the street where Sophia's cars had parked 4 months ago, and the world had shifted its axis. He thought about the job at the foundation, the desk that was being prepared for him, the files he would inherit, the families and situations not unlike the one he had been living inside. He thought about Claire Novak's yellow legal pad and what it meant to know the language that systems are written in, to know where the numbers are wrong and have the will to say so. He thought about what his father had left him and what it actually was, which was not the house, though the house was still his, the aluminum siding and the sagging porch and the morning glories, all still his. He looked at the photograph one more time. He said, to his father, and to himself, and to the quiet street, and to no one in particular, I think I understand now. What you left me was never the debt. It was always the example. He sat there until it was fully dark. The mockingbird was still going somewhere in the maple, working through its whole catalog, tireless and unhurried. David listened to it for a while, then he stood, picked up the photograph, and went inside to start on what came next. The thing about a kindness done quietly and without expectation of return is that it does not disappear when the moment passes. It enters the material of the world in some way that is difficult to quantify but impossible. Finally, to overlook a change in the current, a shift in the possible, a door left open in a hallway that would otherwise have been solid wall. Harold Carter had stopped on a street and asked a man if he was all right. He had done this not because it was strategic, not because he was performing virtue for an audience, not because he had any idea that the man he was speaking to would go on to build something substantial. He had done it because the man looked like he needed help, and Harold Carter was constitutionally incapable of walking past that without stopping. The $480 was the smallest part of it. The couch, the ride, the phone call, these were the practical expressions of something that precedes all transactions and exists independently of them. The simple, radical act of treating a stranger as someone whose situation matters, as someone whose life, continued and improved, is worth the inconvenience of stopping. Gerald Bennett carried that act inside his professional life for 30 years. And the carrying of it shaped what he built and how he built it in the anonymous grants to worker rehabilitation programs, in the foundation that distributed resources to people navigating the same kind of impossible ledger that Harold's own son had been living inside, in the wooden box maintained with its original cash as a symbol of an accounting still open. He could not give Harold back what Harold had given him, because what Harold had given him was not a transaction. He could only try to become, in the remainder of his life, a person who was worthy of it, and in the trying, build things that continued it. The ledger was never meant to close between the two of them. It was meant to open forward, into the lives of people neither of them would ever meet. David Carter understood this fully now, in a way that was not comfortable and easy. The way comfortable and easy understanding tends to be shallow, but the way difficult and earned understanding tends to be permanent. He had spent 3 years believing he was carrying his father's debt. He understood now that he had been carrying his father's legacy, that these were not the same thing, and had never been the same thing, and that the distinction between them was the difference between being crushed by what you have inherited and being clarified by it. He would go to the foundation. He would sit at the desk that had been Gerald Bennett's desk, and he would open the files of families who were doing what he had been doing, people buried under numbers that were not right, people working 2 jobs in the dark, while institutions that should have corrected their errors simply did not. And he would bring to that work everything Harold Carter had given him: the patience, the precision, the meticulous habit of documentation, the absolute refusal to walk past a person sitting in the cold on steps without asking whether they were all right. He had learned from Harold that decency does not announce itself or require acknowledgement to be real. He had learned from Sophia that the consequences of decency outlast by decades the moment in which it is enacted. He had learned from Claire that the language of systems can be learned and used, and that knowing how to use it on behalf of people who cannot is itself a form of the same generosity his father had practiced on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, 25 years before David had any knowledge of it. The debt was settled. The house stood. The ledger, corrected at last, showed a balance that was manageable and honest, and denominated entirely in real numbers. But the larger accounting, the one Gerald Bennett had tried to keep current in a wooden box, the one Harold Carter had never bothered to track because he did not think in those terms, the one that measured not money, but the cumulative consequence of choosing, again and again, to stop that, accounting did not close, it opened. It would keep opening. Into the files on David's new desk. Into the families behind those files. Into the choices those families would make in the years after the immediate crisis had passed, shaped in some irreducible way by the fact that someone had shown up and taken their situation seriously. This was what it looked like, David thought, when a single act of decency traveled through time. Not a monument, not a headline, just a door, left open somewhere, that someone else eventually walked through. The debt was not the story. The legacy was. And somewhere in the catalog of what the mockingbird was singing in the maple outside Harold Carter's house, there was something that sounded in the right kind of quiet, almost like the turning of a page.